All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to In Search of Truth, our monthly program at the Wende Museum that surrounds themes of truth in our modern life. My name is Hannah, and today we are turning our attention to truth and education. In addition to our student council who have planned this event, we have two wonderful guests joining us. Dr. Kelly Kent is a member of the Culver City Unified School Board. She earned her neuroscience doctorate from USC and co-founded AdaptEd Consultants to provide student and parent enrichment and teacher professional development. She also has experience as a university instructor and school volunteer. She's led multiple initiatives to support local schools, including programs for campus beautification, nutrition education, and before school Spanish language instruction. Dr. Kent is a passionate educational advocate and community member. Dr. Catherine McTamaney is a professor at Vanderbilt University who works mostly with undergraduate students in the teacher licensure program. She focuses on social and political context of public education, and I took her introductory class last semester. Additionally, Dr. McTamaney is an expert on Montessori education and compassionate teaching, having written 2 books and a daily blog. Dr. McTamaney encourages her students to think critically about the role of teachers in education, and she provides a foundation for inclusive and equitable classrooms. We are so lucky to have these 2 educators with us today. Today's program is a 45-minute panel discussion moderated by the Wende Museum's Chief Curator, Hugh Siegel, followed by a 15-minute Q&A with the viewers. You can put your questions under the Q&A box, and please keep them short and concise, about 1 or 2 sentences and 1 question at a time. You can submit your questions at any point during the program, and my colleague Lexi will moderate the Q&A today. The In Search of Truth series is sponsored by Apple. Special thanks to Susan Horowitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussions and virtual programs at the Wende Museum. And now I will hand it over to you to get the conversation started.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and welcome everyone. We'll have a very interesting hour ahead of us. We're going to touch on topics like truth and diversity, critical approaches to truth, resources in schools, neurology, the social and political impacts on education, teachers, students and their interactions, and last but not least, student agency. So let's start directly, and Hannah, I want to get back to you immediately because you can open the discussion. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I'm really curious to know, is there a single true way to view the world resulting in one true curriculum for teachers to express to students?
Catherine, yeah, you start. Yeah.
Well, Hannah, it's a great question. You know from class with me that I don't like taking words just to presume that we know what they mean already, and I want to know more about how are you defining the terms that you're using. For curriculum comes from a Latin root that means to run the course, and I think that it's it means to like a path or a track that we run along. You might think about curriculum in a contemporary way as being a set of things, where these are the activities that we do. These are the recipe for what happens in school. But that's not what this word actually means. It means preparing for all the things that happen in a school setting that we can prepare for. And I think the suggestion that curriculum is the thing that we prepare for suggests what it is that we can't prepare for either, which are the students in the space. We can set as many operations into action as we know to predict. But at the end of the day, there still need to be runners on the course. And I think that's where I would sort of push back on the idea that there could be one true curriculum or one true way of being in school, because the best that we can do as educators is really a best bet over what the path might look like before the learners actually arrive.
Right, and that maybe motivates the question, who decides on how the curriculum looks like. So Lexi, I think you have a follow-up question here. Yeah.
Yes, my answer was a little bit kind of answered, but I just wanted to know if there's one universal truth that must be taught to all students, whether that's in a specific subject or just like a fundamental thing that students must learn. And if so, what would that be? And why do schools get to decide what that is? And that can be for either Dr. Kent or Dr. McTamaney.
Yeah, and I think the second part of your question adds a new layer here. Yeah. Cool.
Well, I want to add a little bit to the previous question, although they fold into each other, so I think it's appropriate. When I put on my education hat, I think that one of the primary roles of educators is to teach critical thinking and perspective taking. But I'm a scientist by training, and in my professor role, I teach the science-based courses like neurobiology courses, but also a research course. And so the conversation that I'm always trying to have is around being a skeptic of all things. So scientists like define themselves as being skeptics, even of their trusted colleagues, even of the authorities in the field, even of the consensus or the dogma. They're constantly like questioning the paradigm. And so I'm like very deeply rooted in that idea, and it always applies to the lens that I use when I'm thinking about educational spaces as well. And so to me, like a truth is in the value of critical thinking and perspective taking. So I do believe that there is an obligation of sorts for educators to work within that model. In terms of the institutions deciding on what the truth is, I think there are some questions that you all gave us in advance that are related to this idea in terms of a difference between a how and a what. And I can't help but want to apply my response to that question here, which is that the how is really important. I just spoke to it. Critical thinking and perspective taking, that, right? That's the how, but you actually cannot do the how in a vacuum. You have to do it in an applicable way. You have to apply it to the real world. So you're always massaging the what as you're doing the work of the how, right? And so the how does have to be there. And so you do have to, educational institutions do have to make decisions about the what. And so for me, that's where we go back to science, and we use evidence-based and we use best practices, and we do have to rely on, building upon the previous scholars and continuing to pursue, the academic investigation and interrogation to inform that.
Right. Although you could argue that there might be a difference between hard science on the one hand and a discipline like history on the other, which tends to be more biased and more colored by social and political ideas. And that's actually, Emma, I think, where your question comes from.
Yeah, I think this question, it's interesting. Like when I was thinking of these, I'm not someone who has studied the hard sciences, so I was really looking at it mostly from the lens of the humanities. It's clear kind of thus far, even early in the conversation, that there is no one true curriculum, that you kind of have to look at a classroom of students and decide based on that, maybe how you're going to teach, or if we're looking at the how and the what, which I think is a really helpful delineation. What in the how or the what changes depending on who the students are, and how, if it is changing, how do you make sure that that change does not further divide, ostracize, or segregate students? Kind of, how does it not drive them deeper into thought patterns that might already exist?
And I'm gonna use Kelly's technique too, to just go back to Kelly's answer to get back into an answer for this one, which is that, maybe we're gonna end up listing out all of the old-fashioned rules for journalism, right? But I'd argue back a little bit on the idea that there is even a set of hard questions that define what critical thinking means. I think if there were a universal truth that I were to identify in education, it's that all learning is culturally informed. And so even the idea that there is best practice reflects a particular model of a particular understanding and value inside of our society over what best practices are. And so I think it leads into your question around culturally responsive pedagogy and whether or not there is a way in which we can create culturally sensitive and responsive spaces that are still safe for students who are there, that still do what school's supposed to do, right? Which is to propel and not just to reinforce. So, I mean, in some ways, it's a really loaded question because, as you've pointed out already, if you take the lens of culturally responsive pedagogy, you're already presuming that that really is the one thing that you want to stick on, right? But what if the cultures that you're trying to be responsive to are abhorrent to you? Should school be culturally responsive if the culture from which children are coming or learners are coming is misogynistic, or if it's extremist, or if it's racist? It's the paradox of tolerance that we know really we struggle with inside of school settings, just like any other space where we're trying to create some sort of consensus in a government system and a societal system that's not consensus driven. Ours is a democracy, and education in the United States is designed to inform our democracy. And democracy requires tense debate and verbal conflict, which is not always safe. It's not always comfortable or affirming. And it really does require you to be able to challenge not just what you believe, but why do you believe that thing? And maybe be willing to give it up if you've actually learned something new. I don't think the goal inside of education is to accept that all conclusions are equal, even when you're trying to create a culturally safe space for students. But instead to create spaces that allow for what I would call sort of aspirational debate. Like, how can we argue in deep and authentic ways about what we hope to become, despite how many different places we're coming from? And I think the trick in great teaching is doing so in a way that learners still feel safe to engage in that. You know, that like, if I'm going to engage in tense debate with you, that I have enough hands on my back to be able to not shy away from the kind of really meaty conversations where great learning happens.
And may I quickly follow up with the question, how do you decide whether in those tense debates, the two parties opposite each other have their own truth, or one has a better answer than the other, and who decides that?
Yeah, I think I'm okay with taking that on because it fits in with this question, and I'll fold back and forth if I can try to do so at all elegantly, because that was a really powerful response, Dr. McTamaney. But I do subscribe to a dialectical model of sorts, not in like the old stodgy way that is anti-emotional or not relational, because I believe very much, well, I know that our brains are wired to be social and that our emotions are our intellect, and there is no distinction between the two. And so, but I do believe in, ultimately finding some truth by looking at, two oppositional positions and refining and digging deeper and refining and digging deeper each time. But that it relies on relationships, it relies on interpersonal, but also relies on like a power analysis. Right. And so I think that folds into then the cultural relevancy question and the cultural proficiency in classrooms questions, and also the idea of safe space. And then what I heard you talking about, Dr. McTamaney, was actually what I hear and what I understand is a brave space. And so I've been learning about transforming the idea of safe space into brave space, because often our idea of safe space has been safe for some people, but actually at the expense of the safety for others. And then the work, I think, really is about responding to the room. And so in that question about, how do you deal with who is present, is that I think that's where educators are experts, is that they are aware of who is in their room and they are doing the work to figure out who is in their room. And then I know you're challenging best practices, but if I may just come back to that for a second, there are experts in this matter. I'm just going to cite two. One is Goldie Muhammad, who writes incredible work about cultural proficiency in classrooms. Another one is Zaretta Hammond, who talks about it from a brain-based perspective, which is really fantastic. And so I'll just finish by saying that I think that everything is worthy of interrogation. Everything is worthy of critique critique, but to me, that is the definition of the skepticism and being willing to shift the paradigm. So we're always constrained by a paradigm, always. We didn't used to think that gay marriage was possible. Whether or not we were open to it ourselves as individuals, we used to think it was an impossibility. Very quickly, that shifted in a very short time span. And that was a paradigm shift. And we were able to see something we could not see before.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Megan, welcome. I know you had some connection issues, but actually you were zooming in at exactly the right moment, because we talked a little bit about the critical attitudes towards truth finding. And I know you have a question about exactly that. So if you,
Yeah, definitely. So my question for everybody was, what methods can be utilized in schools to equip students to better understand the meaning of truth and the value of being critical of their perceived truths? I think we've talked a lot about this program of like everybody has their own truth. So like, how can we always be critical, always like changing the idea of what our truths are?
yeah, and I think we touched upon this a little bit, but maybe it's good to ask this question in a very straightforward way. What are the methods to teach critical thinking, in fact? Yeah. Who wants to reply?
I do have thoughts, but I would love to hear from Dr. McTamaney.
You're setting me up first.
It's live.
I think that the explicit standards that are adopted by local school boards are a really strong starting point to say, like, what are the things that this particular system of schools is meant to accomplish, right? I mean, in our model of education, we have sort of two constituencies, like one of them more abstract than the other, that we have to really pay attention to. And one of them is the people who actually design what it is that school is meant to accomplish right now for the practical purposes of this particular moment in society. And then there's also sort of like our best selves, and like in a nobler day, what would we want education to be if it could be all things that it could be, with endless funding and all the time in the world and no other constrictions on it. So I think that those explicit standards are a really great place to start in thinking about how teachers teach about critical thinking and how to be in the school space that way. But I think that it's really important as well to look, and maybe even more important, to look at the hidden curriculum inside of schools, of like, what are the systems that are in place in school settings that teach kids things about whether or not you are valued here, whether or not your opinion is equal to others, whether you're a real person. Is your humanity something that matters here? What are the ways in which the structures of school, the kind of rules of school, either edify or disrupt systems of power? What are the ways in which humans are either protected as being sort of individually sacred, or what are the rules of schools that may actually erode students or humanity? We teach really powerful lessons when we tell students that their worth to our society can be quantified through a single number on a single day test. So, for example, if you are in a school space where all of the happenings, that all the learning that happens in the spring semester of your school is towards one standardized test, there's not a lot of space for a wide, diverse community of perspectives in that, because you still have to take the one test. What are the ways in which the things that we don't say out loud about school or about learning actually may speak much more loudly than the things that are on individual teachers' lesson plans?
Right. Kelly, would you like to elaborate on that or respond?
Yeah, that was fantastic. So I just want to +1 all of that, but I will simply add that, yeah, I think that we need to be talking about how the brain works more, to be very frank. Like, I don't think that credentialing programs are teaching educators enough about how the brain learns best, because I know that most educators don't spend enough time talking to students about how their brains learn best. And so I think that that's like an area for growth in education at large. But in particular, I think that students would do well to be learning about their biases from a very early age. We all have biases. They're there for good reason, by the way. And I'm not talking about implicit biases around race or gender or anything like that. But the idea of a bias is simply that the brain has to come to a very quick guess in order to escape a predator, for instance, right? Like, I only have limited information, but I need to decide if it's a lion or a zebra because one is a predator and the other is not. So I'm going to guess based on not the full picture and either run or stay. That's the system that we have inherited. That's the system that allows us to have biases and to come to erroneous conclusions, including about people that are very harmful, because of course, some of the information that we receive is messaging from outside or even from inside our family systems. But that conversation is not had in most educational spaces, right? How does the brain work? How does it learn best? What are the flaws? What can we do about them now that we know that the brain does have some kind of shortcuts that are error prone?
Right. And I think you have a follow-up question here.
Yeah, I kind of, like, when you talk about Dr. Kent, the way of understanding how the brain works and how people learn really kind of piqued my interest. And I was wondering if you kind of think that there is a truth, a universal way that people learn, or if there's, like, I know we talk a lot about learning styles, so like, are there a certain set of ways that people learn? Does everyone's brain work in the same way or in completely individualized ways?
So the learning style thing is not favored anymore. It's not usually. So, I mean, one thing we know is that universal design for learning is like a much more contemporary understanding of how brains learn best. And that is, so we've sort of left learning styles behind. Just to answer learning styles in particular, like folks in the audience might remember that, like, some people used to think of themselves as visual learners or auditory learners or tactile learners, but the reality is we all have really big occipital lobes, the part that processes vision. It's enormous. It's enormous. We're all visual learners, and we're all emotional learners. We are going to learn what we care about best, right? So we need to be meaningfully engaged. We need to think that it's going to have an impact on something or someone that we love to actually care about it, right? We also have to be challenged. It cannot be too easy or too difficult. In education, it's called the proximal zone of development. I don't know, in neuroscience, I call it like the sweet spot. It's like you have to constantly be at risk of failure. Failure is really the only way that you know you're learning, because if you're already good at something, then the neuronal networks that you need to do the thing have already formed. And so mistakes are actually the only evidence of learning, which also there is not space for that in educational environments most of the time. And so that is a whole reframe that is required. So I do think there are absolutely biological fundamentals for how people learn best. And I think much of them are absent in our educational spaces, right? I mean, even students are expected to leave their emotions at the door. We also forget that the brain doesn't have a different interpretation of emotional pain and physical pain. They're the same in the brain. Right. And so kids come off of the playground with an injury and they're not expected to learn if it's physical. But if they have an emotional injury due to something, bullying or whatever it is, they're expected to get back into their academic performance right away, when the reality is the impact on the brain's bandwidth is the same. The attentional load is still really reduced. So those are some of the fundamentals to learning that I think apply to every single brain.
Thank you. Yeah. So knowledge and a sense of truth, as we all know, is very much depending on sources. But what happens if these sources are not accessible or not readily accessible? As we all know, history is not just a matter of remembering, but at the same also of forgetting. And I think Ella has a very interesting question about that. Yeah.
Hi, well, first, I'd just like to comment about Kelly Kent, your previous answer to the last question, because I'd just like to say that in my experience, I'm taking an AP psychology course in my high school right now. And I think I'm entering this time in my life where it's very empowering to learn some self-knowledge, and especially where it's centered in this educational psychological lens. And currently, as I'm learning about learning and memory and it's sort of different concepts about communication, and I think it's informing me on a personal level, and I can take those lessons and think about them further in the classroom, especially in a classroom where I can experience sort of discourse and where my teacher is very invested in taking these lessons and asking us as students to apply it to our lives and talk about why it's significant. And so I just like to point out that I have that opportunity, and I can really see the value as to why these lessons are important for every student and why such classrooms are really necessary. So that's what I would like to lead with, and then I can come into my question. So I would like to ask, what steps can a teacher take in their classroom to promote inclusive, truthful history when diverse resources are not directly available in the curriculum? So when these resources, when teachers are sort of sourcing these things on their own, sort of going outside that direct model that's outlined by, for instance, the district, as Catherine McTamaney pointed out.
Well, and I'll start my response maybe by defending those large scale systems too. You know, I mean, it's important to contextualize why our system looks the way that it does, and it's an important part of our history in this society. We have a large scale educational system that's justified because this particular model of government requires an educated populace. But we have also a model that prioritizes or privileges this idea of like the United States. We're not actually one thing. We're many, many different things. And the idea of local control and local influence on school standards, on what's taught inside of a classroom, what books are there, that's just as deeply held an American value as the idea of the democracy, right? Like democracy relies on individual engagement. And it's in those kind of deep political debates that can be so unsettling if you want school to be a different kind of place. Like you can watch the kind of heated political battles that are happening right now in school boards all across the country and think, how have we devolved into this? But I think that those pressures are actually a reflection of what's a real core tension for this particular societal model. That if you want to have a democracy that demands the engagement of individuals, and our history sort of prioritizes that individual meritocracy-driven space, it's going to come into conflict a lot. And it's going to come into conflict in the spaces that we feel the most intimately connected to, which for most places is school. School is this space where our children, our families, our local communities are really tightly tied there in ways that, like, the interstate system just does not evoke your heart the way that that your child's classroom teacher does. So, public education is a public good, but deciding what's good for the public requires a lot more consensus than we as a society are kind of programmed to commit to. So I would say, again, like, come back to the specifics in the classroom, come back to the hidden curriculum. Like, I may not have the open-ended standards-based curricular kits that are going to support the kind of teaching that you're hoping for, but that information is available to you. It's not inaccessible to students. What's necessary for me as a teacher in that space is asserting that curiosity matters, that the idea of looking for truth matters, even if, day to day, there may be other pressures on our classroom. Hannah mentioned that I'm a Montessorian by training, and Montessori said the more perfect the approximation to truth, the more perfect is art. And I love that as a sense of what it is that we should be thinking about in classroom spaces, because it it sort of pushes back on the idea that what happens in classrooms should be largely standardized, and says that no, like there should be an aesthetic of beauty that happens in classrooms too. And when that's there, like all these other things like students feeling welcome and hard truths being something that you can grapple with are also you can see those conversations as beautiful too, and not just as politically problematic the way that I think right now we tend to.
Right. Well, if I understood Ella's question correctly, I think there's also another aspect to it, and that is that, as you mentioned, people who are curious can find information, which of course in principle is true. But for instance, some schools have more finances than others, so more means to add to their library. Some schools just decided to ban certain books because they tell a kind of truth that some of the parents don't want to convey to the kids. What is your response to those inequities?
You want to take that, Dr. Kent? I have thoughts, but I've been talking for a while.
I mean, I'm interested to hear what you have to say, because I actually don't feel that I have wonderful answers on this. I'll speak just briefly that we are living in an era where the cross geographical boundary access is tremendous, and so teachers are totally taking advantage of that, and they're no longer relying on their professional learning communities that are insular just within their site or their district. They're really going across regions and states and sometimes even larger to share resources. So they are supporting each other, and in that way, they're a model to all of us. In terms of dealing with the current backlash that you're talking about and the book banning, we are not facing that in this district. So I haven't had to reckon with it. I am personally horrified and offended, and I would, I would resist that if that movement were to start here. And we are not immune, because of course there is a national movement working on this, so it may come knocking on our door very soon. I think the question of book banning in general is a fascinating one. Do you all know that Burbank district here in Los Angeles County banned books? And these were books that used the N-word and degraded Black people in other ways. And so the source of the banning was different than what's happening in Texas and in Florida. Mm-hmm. So I'm intrigued. I want to be part of these conversations. I don't have wise answers right now.
Thank you. Catherine, do you want to add something to this?
I'm knee deep in the book banning right now. The district immediate to ours here in Nashville, where Vanderbilt is, banned the graphic novel Mouse just maybe 2 weeks ago. I'm always frustrated that Tennessee, there are a lot of good things that happen in Tennessee, despite what you see on the nightly news. But we tend to draw a lot of attention to ourselves for the more problematic choices that get implemented here. To come back to your question, I think education is a political act, and I don't think that you can untangle the work of teachers from the political bodies in which that we both are responsive to and that we help to inform. They just can't be untangled. But it's also not just the individual classroom teachers' actions that do that. The way that we structure schools, how we fund them, how we design them architecturally matters to whether or not schools are spaces that people feel safe to engage in, how we design them as intellectual spaces, what texts are welcome or unwelcome, even who's qualified to be called a teacher. These are all deeply political statements that reflect much bigger values, more deeply held and more difficult to undo or to change the direction of than a single classroom may be able to influence. When Hannah mentioned earlier learning styles and Dr. Kent was responding to that, I thought this is common, right? Is that what is happening in university settings to understand teaching and learning is like a generation farther on than what's actually happening in K-12 school settings. And some of that is the nature of how this particular model for implementing reform also works, that it takes a long time to get new knowledge into traditional school spaces, and it takes an even longer time to undo the direction that schools are in already. When we know when Hannah graduates from Vanderbilt in a couple of years, we're going to have about 3 years after she's out there to, is it just one? Good, googly, stay longer. Don't leave yet. It's not safe. But we've got about 3 years before graduates will look more like the schools that they are teaching in than like the teacher education programs that prepared them. And if schools right now are not ideal places for learning, it changes that we have to think about teacher education to know that you're not just going to have to be a great teacher, but you're also going to have to be a large scale political social structure reform agent. Or this whole process is going to take another few generations before we get to the kinds of goals that you're talking about tonight.
Right. Thank you very much. With an eye on the clock, we are going to skip a few of the prepared questions, but with the possibility that they will come up again during the Q&A. For the viewers, if you already want to ask questions, please start putting them under the Q&A box. And I would like to go to Jana, who has a specific question, I think, for Kelly Kent about the field of neuroscience and the gender relations there. Yeah.
Yes. Through becoming a neuroscientist and being part of a field that's viewed as being heavily dominated by men, how do you believe that it affected your personal truth and perceptions regarding the field? And how do you incorporate that view of yours into your work within the field, but also through your work as a board member?
Yeah, so I think that the thing that probably many of us can relate to in this room is that when you're like a minority in the space, for lack of a better term, you struggle with, especially in elite spaces, you struggle with imposter syndrome all the time. So that is very real. It is for me, it is a fraction of what folks who are more marginalized than me experience. But I did absolutely experience being the only woman in the room much of the time. There's no question. I think in some ways, I will forever, every time I speak publicly, less so about neuroscience now, because there is something to, spending 10 to 15 years, becoming an expert in one really small sliver of the world, right? You do have some degree of comfort around it, but where it extends into my political life, I feel that all the time, right? There's especially because in politics, I'm even more of an exception to the rule in a number of ways. And so I'm always like, oh, someone's going to come along with that cane and like drag me off the stage, right? And so I think where it does prepare me though for the work is that, I'm really comfortable challenging dogmas, right? And that is both my science training and just having to live with the constant self-talk of I belong here. And so that means I necessarily have to ask questions about what is the dogma that everyone else is viewing, this problem through that I can bust, that I can help break, like just reframe. So I think, being in a marginalized position does give you some unique skill sets. It's not that I advocate for it, but there is some training and resilience there that is extremely powerful in politics. And I would argue now more than ever on school boards in particular.
Right. So another point we might touch upon is biases in teaching. And Lexi, you have a question about that. Yeah.
I just put my AirPods in. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So you guys kind of touched on this a little bit before, but how exactly does a teacher's own bias influence what they teach their students, kind of going off of their curriculum? And how can students keep their teachers accountable? I know that there is a drastic power dynamic in certain schools, especially in high schools, and students might not always feel comfortable going to their teachers and holding them accountable, but how can we start to let students know that is okay and just let them know that they are heard or just there?
I think as a classroom teacher, one of the things that I really struggle with is that I don't know what my biases necessarily are until somebody else points them out to me. But I think I'll kind of come back to a core belief that I have about teaching spaces, which is that learning is, Dr. Kent called it brave spaces, but I think learning is a daring act. And it requires a willingness to take risk, to be able to give up what you believe right now about how the world works or some content area that we're learning about in order to take on something that's being offered to you that's new. And that doesn't happen without a trusting relationship. So I don't think it happens in a meaningful way anyway. It doesn't stick. I might be able to get you to give me back the right answer on a test, but I don't know if it's actually going to deeply inform who you are, how you see the world, unless you actually have bought into it in a more authentic way. So if you're to learn from me, you have to first trust me, and trusting relationships they go both directions, which also means that I have to be willing to make large mistakes in front of you. And I have to model in my teaching a willingness to self-assess. So, I'll give you a very practical example that just literally came up this week in my teaching. I'm teaching a class on learning and development, curricular models for children from 0 to 8. And we've got our textbook, and it's the textbook I've used for years, and I have a body of theorists, and they're the body of theorists that I've used for years, and we have all of our activities, and there is a standard knowledge base that I'm really good at. I can tell you all about the traditional Western informed early childhood educational theorists. And one of my students brought me forward a journal article about the supremacy of whiteness inside of early childhood theory. It's new. It's a new conversation that we have not been having. I have done this work in my social and political context class. I've done it in society, school, and teaching, the spaces that are sort of more like I already know that I need to be thinking about students differently and thinking about decolonizing my syllabi differently there and bringing in new voices differently. It hadn't occurred to me that the standards of early childhood were another space I needed to look. And I had a student who brought me it. And so guess what I get to do on Friday morning? I get to go sit down with my 37 students and say, I screwed this one up. And there was this really large area that I should have known to look. I didn't know to look. And it's only because one of you pointed it out. So now we've got to revisit what we're doing, because you do the best you can until you know to do something differently. And now I know that there's more that we have to do. So we're gonna have to make some changes to the syllabus. We're not gonna wait till next year and fix it sometime in the future. But the first thing I have to do as a teacher in that space is sit down and acknowledge that there is this really big, important piece that I wasn't talking about, that, but for them being honest with me, I wouldn't have known to address. So, I think it's there's so much in that dynamic of creating a trusting space and modeling your own fallibility as teachers, and really trusting your students enough to know that if you value them and know that you value them, they're also going to want to make your classroom a stronger place. It really ends up being in all of our best interest for my students to be empowered to change what happens in the classroom, because better learning happens there, and then we all want to show up more.
Great, thank you. And Jana, I think this more or less also answers your follow-up question, right? Or do you want to add something to that? Yeah.
No, she perfectly answered my question as well.
Yeah, I thought so. So, and that's great, because it's about time to go to the Q&A. But before we do so, there is one last question about student agency that I think is a very nice conclusion of the discussion part of today's program. And Ella, I invite you to ask that question. Yeah.
Hi, so I would like to follow up with some comments that Professor McTamaney made earlier about the slow progression of contemporary revisions in schools. Well, first, I'd like to say that I think that you addressed how we can make these changes from an educator's lens, just in your previous comments, but I actually want to address the panelists, because I know that many of us are students, and I want to ask, have you seen your teachers take similar steps to introduce new information in your learning spaces and encourage a more informed critical lens?
Just raise your hand if you want to respond to this. Yeah, Hannah?
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about from a college student perspective a little bit. I do have Dr. McTamaney as my professor. It's lovely. And I did notice a lot in the class how she really emphasized amplifying other voices by using their voices. And so through videos or audio and things like, and like our quotations and readings, as opposed to kind of translating that from her own perspective, which I thought was a really interesting way of expressing other people's ideas, because I hadn't engaged with that a lot before in my high school education. So that was just something that I really remembered and took note of.
Thank you. And with that, let's move on to the Q&A, and I'll hand it over to Lexi to moderate the next part of today's program.
Okay, great, thank you. So if anybody has any questions, you can put it in under the Q&A box, and I will select and read them. And as Hannah mentioned, please keep them short, like 1 or 2 sentences, and to the point so that we can answer them before 5 p.m.
Actually, there's already a question under the Q&A. You can take it. Yeah.
Okay, I'll read this right now. Someone said, please speak about how respect and civility play into communication, about the search for truth when there is so much vitriol in the education arena today. I don't know if I said that right.
You know, I teach a class in the social and political context of schools that the premise for the class is that we are in the only place we possibly could be, given our history and everything that's come before. So if you really want to understand why we are where we are now, you have to look back and say what got us here, because it's the only place we could have landed. I think the challenges in our current educational system didn't fall from the sky. They are the outcome of who we are as a populace. And again, I wonder if it's not a pretty predictable place to be for a society that favors an individualistic lens. The myth of the American meritocracy fuels a distrust between our citizens. And I think that distrust is no more evident right now than when we try to agree on what it is that school should be if school is supposed to be for the common good. Where is the common in an individually driven society? You see it in the violent responses at school board meetings to common sense mask regulations here in the American South, or in the uninformed objections to teaching just regular fact-based history. But you also see it, frankly, in the rhetoric of the intelligentsia that kind of dismisses that other perspective as being stupid or being ignorant. And I think to the degree that we allow ourselves to continue to separate out into others, that's informed by the way our society works, we're going to keep seeing that level of hostility and incivility. I mean, I think I spent so much time this afternoon watching your last panel that was mostly just the students, and felt like, oh gosh, there's the great hope, right? Because you're talking to each other differently than we have modeled for you. And I think that's where we're going to come back to it, is that especially with the slow movement of education reform, it's not going to come from the teachers. It's not going to come from a generation of policymakers who have already been elected. It's the next people who have looked at the society we've helped to create and said, we don't want it that way anymore. And we're going to work to create a really substantively different dialogue here that protects a different part of what might be important to preserve in this American ideal.
Yeah, I think my contribution is going to be a little more about my personal experience, because you know, I'm experiencing harassment currently, incivility and disrespect, and so it's a challenge, and I'm having trouble, you know, making space for that. So, you know, I can just say that it is very difficult to, you know, have controversy with civility currently, which is, you know, what is demanded. We need to have the controversy. It's very important. That's the work, but we can't do it without civility. And so it's just a very present challenge that I face, where I'm having ongoing conversations that I have to cut short because they will do harm to me. You know, I can't. And then in terms of the, you know, the hope for the future, which I hear Dr. McTamaney talking about, and which I absolutely do also hold, I have a couple thoughts about that. I mean, when I also see parents using their children as pawns in this current uncivil debate. And so that makes me sad. And so while I have a lot of hope for, you know, the kind of conversations we're having right now and the students leading it, I also worry. But, you know, it does get back to a question you all posed that we didn't get to speak to here in the group around student agency. I do think that while, especially in high school environments, you spoke to this earlier, that there's a power dynamic that can sometimes prevent students from feeling like they can hold their educators accountable. But they also do have more power in groups, you know, and our high school, our students formed a student union, which is different than the student body government usual institutions, right? But they actually formed a student union as a way to, you know, have a collective voice. And I think that that is really a model that I would love to see, you know, grow. And I think that we have a real obligation to mean it when we say that we believe in student voice. I think a lot of people talk about it, but we're not doing all of the work of walking that talk. They're like particularly poised for genius. I mean, in some ways, they're like the most wise amongst us, right? They're learning all the latest facts. They have the most at stake because their entire lives are in front of them. And they're, you know, the part of their brain that is most innovative is supremely plastic. So it's like they really are poised to have all the answers if we just listen.
Okay, and I will ask one last question that kind of goes to that controversial nature of education and learning. In the chat, someone said, I have read a lot recently about teachers self-censoring because of the current cancel culture. And what is this effect in the classroom of the self-censoring and just cancel culture in general?
I'm worried for our teachers. You know, it's a really hard space to be right now. I think especially because we sort of presume that teachers are held to be both the cause and the cure to every societal blame. And the people that we place in that space are people who have to, they have to go through really extraordinary measures to demonstrate their ability to do that work, to be qualified to do that work, to then be underpaid, undervalued, and overworked, especially for the first 5 or 6 years of their careers. It's hard. And I think we're putting a lot of additional pressures on teachers because the level of hostility, it's an easy target. You know, and I think I think the divisions that Dr. Kent is talking about inside of how we engage people, like officials in our spaces, people that are seen as being an authority, whether it's an elected official or a classroom teacher or school administrator, they're fierce. I don't know that we do very much to the same space for feeling welcome and supported and safe that students need. Teachers need to be in those spaces as well. So, I mean, I think that there are a lot of things that are happening that sort of fuel that. There's higher competitiveness across the board. There's a higher competitiveness for a smaller number of higher education institutions. There's an erosion of liberal arts as a value across those spaces. There's a much more fiercely revenue-driven preference for the STEM subjects. Parents are overworked and overextended. There's a lack of housing stability, a lack of economic stability. I mean, all of these things are falling on teachers' backs. It's not just cancel culture. It's every other problem in society as well that we're asked to be the people who fix. I don't know I don't know how quickly we can address it, except for to say that if we don't have each other's backs as a society, we're not going to get there. And I think if there's like the lack of trust that exists in our political conversation right now, may be the highest risk to education being able to do what I think it has the capacity to do.
Thank you so much for that. Unfortunately, it is time because this has been an hour, but I just wanted to say I've learned so much in this short period of time, and I'm sure everybody that's viewing has as well. Thank you, Dr. Kent and Dr. McTamaney, for just sharing your opinions and listening to us and answering our questions. And I know this is one of our best ones yet. Before we end, just wanted to let everyone know that we will be having another discussion program Wednesday, March 23rd. And yes, is there anything else?
No, thank you so much again, Kelly and Catherine. And yeah, I hope to see you all for our next discussion next month on the 23rd of March. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.